Hello there. Welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I do hope you're doing remarkably well. I'm doing great, thank you very much, and I'm so glad you've joined me for part 4, which is the final part of our story tonight. And what an incredible story. And what we've got here is Paulette now with her daughter's baby, and her daughter has given her the baby over to her mother to adopt it as her own because her mother had lost a baby. And now she's taking a walk in the woodgrove with her dog, who is behaving incredibly strangely. And then she sees the reason why her dog is behaving strangely, because a golden retriever belonging to the next door neighbour, who's a golden retriever breeder, has suddenly ventured onto the property. And of course her Otis is her dog, who has not been done, he hasn't been neutered, and so he's very excited about this golden retriever who's in season. So let's continue with our story, shall we? Seconds later, Alice Garner was sashaying through the trees, moving towards her, wearing a rather disgruntled expression on her face, stopping short when she saw Paulette trying to yank her dog off Mutsy's rear end. "Get off, Otis, for goodness sake! Stop it now!" said Paulette, looking up at Mrs. Garner apologetically. Mrs. Garner frowned. "Are you telling me your silly little mongrel has not had the snip?" she asked Paulette accusingly, as if it hadn't even remotely occurred to her that she was trespassing onto private property, as was her dog Mutsy. It was hardly Paulette's fault that Alice's dog had got onto their property. And if the woman's golden retriever was hell-bent on the next generation of her puppies carrying Otis's DNA, of what fault was that of hers? Was it really such a train smash? There were worse things that could happen. But even professional breeders had to have slip-ups now and again, surely. Although when Paulette looked at Mrs. Garner, she very much doubted this woman ever made any mistakes. "No, he hasn't, I'm afraid. My husband, you know, he doesn't like the thought of Otis having the snip." "Oh, he's one of those men, is he?" said Mrs. Garner, rolling her eyes in the back of her head in exasperation. "So typical, isn't it? Why are some men so freaked out about having their male dogs neutered? Surely you could have talked him around. My dogs have not been spayed because they are breeding dogs. I can't have that nasty little runt of yours impregnating my precious little Mutsy. I'm sorry, but I just can't. It would ruin my illustrious reputation, and a good source of my income, I might add, as well." "What's wrong with Otis?" said Paulette, sounding rather annoyed. "He's a very handsome dog, I'll have you know." "Your dog is a mixed breed. Mine are pure. Whether he's handsome or not means nothing at all. It doesn't change the fact that your dog is a mongrel. There is a huge difference. Besides, Mutsy is due to be mated by a very handsome golden retriever called Sir Lancelot. He's supposed to be here tomorrow morning. And his very expensive seed does not come remotely cheap, let me tell you. It's highly in demand. Now you need to get that dog of yours off my Mutsy. He just won't stop, will he? And I can't have my little girl impregnated by a half-breed like him. I'm sorry, but I just can't." "Otis is not a half-breed," said Paulette indignantly. "He's a beautiful dog, and probably, I would say, a hell of a lot more handsome than Sir Lancelot. And he's got a lovely temperament, I'll have you know." "Oh, please, you don't know what you're talking about. I'm a professional breeder. I do this for a living, so bloodlines are incredibly important to me. I've been breeding golden retrievers all my life, so I know exactly what I'm talking about. Mutsy is in season right now, and your dog is all over her like a bad smell, because he hasn't been done. You should take responsibility for your dog, you know." "There is nothing wrong with my dog, Mrs. Garner. For your information, you're the one at fault here. You're trespassing on my property, and it's not the other way round. So you have no right to be mad at me, or Otis for that matter. It's your Mutsy that got onto my property, and so did you." "Well, that is hardly my fault, is it? Your dog made a hole in the fence of mine, which Mutsy got through. I was the one that climbed over the fence to come after my dog. You need to get that fence fixed as soon as possible. It's clearly not strong enough. Need I remind you that none of this would have transpired if my dog hadn't been so rudely harassed by your mixed-breed mongrel? People are waiting in line, I will have you know, for the next generation of Mutsy's puppies, and I want to ensure Sir Lancelot is the father. Well, I'm sure he will be. Don't worry, Mrs. Garner. I doubt there's anything to worry about. I've managed to stop them being intimate. Mrs. Garner looked appalled as she stared at Paulette scathingly. She let out a mock sarcastic laugh. You are a dog owner, and you know absolutely nothing about dogs. And I hope you get that hole in the fence treated straight away because it's your responsibility. I am quite sure your dog made it to get to my Mutsy. He's got no manners whatsoever, has he? He's all over her, isn't he? If you ask me, your Mutsy is equally as promiscuous, Paulette said defensively. I mean, look at her. She's loving the attention he's giving her, isn't she? Now get off, Otis. Get off her back now. Off! Off! Ugh! It is just too disgusting to watch this. That dog of yours. Mrs. Garner raised her eyebrow. Come on, Mutsy. Let's get out of here at once. We don't have to listen to this, do we? You're going to have beautiful puppies with Sir Lancelot, aren't you? He's coming to the house tomorrow morning, so don't you dare go fraternising with that smutty immoral thing over there. That dog is way beneath you, Mutsy. Don't forget it either. She reached out for her dog and put the lead on a very reluctant Mutsy. I want no more of this licentious behaviour. Do you understand? She said, wagging her finger at her dog. But Mutsy gave her owner no attention at all. She was looking back longingly at Otis, drooling over him like a bone. Otis was running after Mutsy and attempting to mount her again, and his eagerness seemed unquenchable. Paulette felt the heat rise up in her face. She felt embarrassed and somewhat responsible for Otis's raunchy, reprobate behaviour. And this would not have happened if he'd been neutered. His unruly, raging hormones were going ballistic over Mutsy being in season, and it was hardly his fault. Get that dog of yours away at once, said Mrs. Garner, looking at Otis in abject disgust. Shoo, dog, shoo, go away, she said, waving her arms at Otis. Get back here, Otis, said Paulette, unable to know what to do in this awkwardly uncomfortable situation, where she had no lead at her disposal to put on her unbridled dog. And then, thinking fast on her feet, she instinctively pulled the silk summer scarf she was wearing off her neck and attached it to her dog's collar, pulling Otis to her side, reprimanding him severely for his inappropriate, insubordinate behaviour. Stop this, Otis! Stop this at once! She said, pulling her dog as far away from Mutsy as she could get. Both dogs were now panting furiously after all the physical exertion and excitement, their eyes still fixed on each other. Otis's tail began to slide between his legs. His dark eyes looked sorrowful as Mrs. Garner began to pull Mutsy away by the lead. Otis began to whimper. You need to get that dog of yours neutered. Look at him! He's practically drooling, she said, stopping for a brief second. I can't have him impregnating any of my Goldens when they come into season. I would advise you to do the right thing and get him done as soon as possible. And as for the fence, you need to get it fixed. It's your responsibility. But it was your dog, Mrs. Garner, that broke through the fence. Well, that's hardly my problem, is it? Said Mrs. Garner. Honestly, you city folk know nothing, do you? Absolutely nothing. Why am I not surprised? You are completely clueless, the whole damn lot of you. Why you come to the countryside, I cannot even comprehend. I knew it was a train wreck your moving next door to me like this. And with that, Mrs. Garner stormed off impetuously, grunting under her breath something rather rude about city folk not belonging in the country because they were so lame-witted. Paulette felt rather annoyed with her disagreeable, somewhat arbitrary next-door neighbour, who was being ludicrously unreasonable as far as she was concerned. She was, however, rather thankful for the long summer scarf she happened to be wearing, because without it she'd have never been able to drag Otis away from Mutsy. It had been a useful makeshift lead. She walked with him back towards where she'd parked the baby's stroller. In all the mayhem that Otis and Mutsy had invariably caused, she had forgotten all about little Poppy. Pulling a reluctant Otis to her side, who appeared to still be whimpering with disappointment of having been so unfortunately dragged away from an irresistible female dog, he had been overly excited about his interaction with Mutsy, and was not best pleased to have been reined in like this. Paulette decided she'd have to take him in for the snip, as God forbid she didn't want to set that cantankerous Mrs. Garner off on a tangent again, if Otis was to unfortunately impregnate one of her blue-blooded retrievers. She'd get the fence fixed as well, and the less she had to do with Mrs. Garner the better. She could hear her little baby girl, Poppy, gurgling with delight, which really was strange, as she had expected to come back to the stroller finding her daughter very upset, because she'd been unattended to for so long. But instead she appeared to be gurgling happily, as if she was having the time of her life, which was exceedingly bizarre. When Paulette got closer to the stroller, she stopped dead in her tracks, for she observed a female Bigfoot, quite a lot shorter than the male Bigfoot she had previously encountered a while back, appeared to be holding little Poppy in her arms and bouncing the little girl up and down in arithmetic motion. She was looking at Poppy through her besotted dark eyes. Paulette did not know how to react, as her chubby-cheeked daughter was loving her interaction with the female Bigfoot, who was so naturally maternal. She was gurgling in delight. Paulette instinctively knew that Poppy was in absolutely no danger whatsoever, so she stood there for a moment, watching the scene unfolding before her in awe, as her little girl began pulling the Bigfoot's hair. The female Bigfoot, suddenly sensing she was not alone, turned around to look directly at Paulette, and for a moment their eyes met. Paulette noticed that, much like the male Bigfoot, the female had very kind eyes. And then she did the most extraordinary thing. She spoke to Paulette in a foreign language, but the meaning of her words was automatically downloaded into Paulette's head. How could that happen, Paulette wondered? But this unlikely conversation felt as natural as having a chat with a good old friend at the coffee shop. Kikakwilo, ogila gilaso, antalani. Little ones need watching, the Bigfoot told her. I hope that you are not concerned about me, because I mean your little girl no harm. She was crying. I couldn't leave her alone. I had to comfort her. I hope you don't mind my intrusion. Paulette watched as the female Bigfoot very gently replaced little Poppy back into the stroller. I have a baby too. I know exactly what they like. They demand attention all the time, she told her proudly. My sister's watching over her now. Yours is beautiful. And with that, she nodded at Paulette and glided away and was gone, before Paulette could actually respond in kind. She felt honoured to have met such a gentle, loving creature who had taken it upon herself to watch over her little baby, while she was dealing with that pugnacious, rather cranky next-door neighbour, who had expressed some rather unkind grievances over Otis. In that short period of time she had abandoned her daughter's stroller under a tree, and she had been drawn away by the powerful distraction that had monopolized her attention, so that, dare she admit it, she had almost forgotten about little Poppy, which made her feel like a bad, irresponsible mother. Paulette had not even heard Poppy cry, but she clearly had not done so, as the Bigfoot had come to her immediate rescue and offered her the comfort she needed. Paulette was sure the female Bigfoot was probably the partner of the kind male she had previously met a while before, and felt decidedly happy that with those two large, ponderous Bigfoots around, how could she not feel safe? Paulette wisely decided not to tell her husband about her idiosyncratic encounter with the female Bigfoot, as once again she didn't fancy going to great lengths in persuading him that such creatures did exist, and that the encounter had rarely occurred. She was most sure he would never believe a word of it, but she did tell him about Mrs. Garner, as the fence needed fixing, and besides she needed to persuade him that Otis had to have the snip. His outrageous, licentious behaviour in the woodgrove with Mutsy was enough to convince her of this fact. As far as Paulette was concerned, her husband could protest the procedure as much as he liked, but she would put her foot down on this one. Mrs. Garner was absolutely right, even though Paulette was loath to admit it. But Otis should have been neutered a long time ago, and with Mrs. Garner's golden retrievers regularly coming into season for purposes of breeding, their scent would wildly excite Otis and potentially make him wander off, in the hope of grabbing an opportunity of copulating with one of Mrs. Garner's dogs, and she couldn't allow that to happen under any circumstances. That episode in the woods had been humiliating enough, and it could never be repeated again.
"Bloody cheek," said her husband. "Who does that woman think she is? Telling us to get Otis neutered. That's not going to happen. Otis is not going to be demasculated. I will not have it."
"Don't be ridiculous, Athol. Listen to yourself. Anyone would think I was taking you for the snip. You're overreacting. We need to get Otis done. It's very important. Let's not kid. None of this would have ever happened if Otis had been neutered. You should have seen the way he was behaving in the woods. It was downright embarrassing, Athol, the way he was humping that female dog. And I couldn't get him off, Mutsy, no matter how hard I tried. He wouldn't listen. His obedience went flying out of the window. I kept calling him off her, but he willfully ignored me. And he's normally such a well-behaved dog. You should have seen the condescending way Mrs. Garner was looking down on me, as if I was incapable of controlling my dog. And you know what, Athol? For the first time, I was incapable of controlling Otis. He was out of control. She was absolutely appalled he wasn't neutered.
Goodness gracious me, do I care what that bat thinks? Of course I don't.
Well, all I can say, Athol, is thank goodness I was wearing a scarf around my neck. I didn't have a lead with me. Thankfully, I was able to pull Otis away from Mutsy. He was refusing to listen to me. Mutsy, of course, was enjoying all the fuss, loving every minute she was. Absolutely in her element.
Well, it sounds to me as if this Mutsy is the one that's caused all the problems. Why are you pointing a finger at old Otis? Mutsy is equally as responsible. Don't they say it takes two to tango?
Well, I don't know, but either way, Athol, we do need to get our dog done. I just don't know what other choice we have in the matter. And I think it was Otis who might have made a hole in the fence and not the other way round. And God forbid he's actually impregnated one of Mrs. Garner's dogs. If that has happened, we will not hear the end of it, and I can promise you of that. Mrs. Garner obviously has a very low opinion of city folk. She made her opinions clear. She thinks we have no clue what we're doing living here. And she thinks that you have great issues about Otis being done.
What's that supposed to mean?
Said Athol curtly. Well, she thinks men are afraid of having their dogs done for obvious reasons, said Paulette, chuckling.
Well, how would that cow like it if she had those great big udders of hers removed? Said Athol in a retaliating approach.
Now who's the one who's getting all sensitive and touchy? Said Paulette. Besides, I don't think Mrs. Garner has big udders. Unfortunately for you, I suspect she has very small breasts. The woman is incredibly petite. But like you, I don't want that insufferable, nauseating, pompous woman breathing down our necks a moment longer. She had the audacity to call Otis a half-breed, as if he was inferior in some way, because he's got poodle and Labrador mix in him, and he isn't a thoroughbred.
Don't take it personally, love, said Athol. Breeders can be incredibly snooty when it comes to dog breeds. That's how they actually think. They're notoriously pedantic about bloodlines. They have a reputation for being fastidious about those kind of details.
Well, if Mrs. Garner's been breeding golden retrievers for years, love, she certainly doesn't want Otis sowing his wild seed with her queens, does she? That would likely go down with her like a lead balloon. And I guarantee there will be a fallout with her. And we do want to continue living in this peaceful part of the world. The last thing we need is to be at loggerheads with our neighbours. That's why we have to fix the hole in the fence.
Apparently the fence is our responsibility, and we need to get Otis neutered so that we have as little interaction with that woman as humanly possible, because I, for one, want nothing more to do with her. She's a prize cow." "Well, much as I hate the idea of Otis being castrated, I think we are left with little choice. We will have to get him done. Otherwise he's going to be impossible to control every time one of those golden retrievers next door comes into heat."
9 weeks later, or thereabouts. It had been an overcast morning, with a grey sky that hinted of the promise of rain, and then the heavens finally opened, and the rain pelted down with a steely, hard, resolute determination, while droplets of water were slowly sliding down the glass panes of the window. Paulette loved the rain, especially the smell of petrichor over the countryside after the rains finally subsided. It was a cosy feeling being tucked away in the house, while the world outside her window was being vibrantly refreshed. The countryside seemed to sigh with relief as it drank up all this water. Everything looked lush and green, while the foliage in the yard sparkled under the opaque droplets of rain. On this pleasing morning, with the radio playing soft country music in the background, in time to the drumming sounds of the rain, Paulette was feeding little Poppy in her high chair, pretending that every single spoonful of pureed pumpkin that entered her daughter's mouth was a fast-moving chuk-chuk train. "The chuk-chuk train is coming through the tunnel," she said. "Open the gates." And Poppy would obediently open her mouth wide to receive a spoonful of the pumpkin, always with a happy, rather delighted chuckle. "Chuck-chuck," she said. "Chuck-chuck." Regretfully, Poppy was a messy eater, and much of the pumpkin was splattered all over her mouth, while Paulette was wiping it away with a paper towel, and little Poppy was gurgling away happily. "You're quite the messy eater, aren't you, Poppy? You're worse than both Chloe and Boyd were at your age. You're showing them up with your messiness, you really are. You're an adorable but very messy eater. Look at the mess all over your bib. How much pumpkin did you actually get to eat?" Her daughter chuckled. "Chuck, chuck! Chuck, chuck!" she cried. Poppy smashed her tiny little hands against the table of her high chair, as if it was all one big exciting game. Otis was lying contentedly stretched across the porcelain tiles of the kitchen floor. He looked up at Paulette and Poppy through dark eyes. He began to woof, his ears cocked forward, and then he bolted out of the kitchen and ran straight to the front door, barking excitedly, his tail thumping rather madly. Paulette knew that Otis must have heard something or someone, but she wasn't expecting a visitor, and this was the one day in the month that Athol was away from home, meeting up with business colleagues in Atlanta. That was when she heard the rubber tires crunching over the pebbles of their driveway, and finally coming to a stop. The rain was coming down in sheets by now, and Paulette sighed. She recognized the truck parked in her driveway. It belonged to Mrs. Alice Garner. What the hell was that annoying woman doing, sitting in the front seat, parked there, while she waited for the rain to abate? All Paulette could think about was what had she done now. The last time she'd seen the formidable woman was in the woodgrove when Otis had been mounting her dog, who appeared to have been seeking her dog out as far as she was concerned. Since then Otis had been neutered, and the fence repaired. She had hoped she'd seen the last of this pompous, arrogant woman, but now here she was on her property again, like a thorny thistle, making its ugly appearance known. She noticed there were 2 well-behaved golden retrievers sitting in the back of her truck, that were staring out at the rain rolling down the truck's windows. "What do you want, woman?" said Paulette under her breath. "Why don't you just go away? Leave me alone, will you?" The unabashful rain continued for another half-hour, but the patient, long-suffering Mrs. Garner remained resolutely parked outside the house, until finally the rain took a reprieve, and Mrs. Garner climbed out of her truck, tossing her short grey hair aside, and charging over to the front door, with a cantankerous look on her face. Paulette had half a mind to ignore the woman, as her loud, brusque knocking was more than a little intimidating. "I know you're there," came Mrs. Garner's voice. "Are you going to answer or not? Because if you don't answer the door, I will stay here all day until you actually do." Very reluctantly, with a vacillating hesitancy, Paulette manoeuvred herself to the front door and opened it gently, but Mrs. Garner pushed past her and marched into her house, and then with her short legs splayed like a contemptuous bull-terrier, she practically growled at Paulette, staring at her through furious brown eyes that suggested that Paulette had done something to cause her great upset, as the incandescent woman looked more than a little peeved.
"I hope you're proud of yourself. Congratulations are obviously in order. Last night my Mutsy, can you believe that? Gave birth to 7 puppies. They're black and white. They're definitely Otis's lineage, and they don't belong to Sir Lancelot. Your dog has impregnated my Mutsy with less than illustrious seed, and now I've lost income thanks to you. There were people waiting for Mutsy's next litter. I had puppies on order, and now look what's happened."
"I'm very sorry, Mrs. Garner. I don't know what to say."
"You don't know what to say? Lost for words, are you? If you had been responsible as a dog owner, you would have got your dog neutered a long time ago, wouldn't you? But no, you didn't do that. Your pathetic husband got all squeamish about the idea of it. It sounds like he needs to be neutered himself. I want compensation for all the income I've lost thanks to your dog, to the value of 7 golden retrievers. I've lost a lot of money, and furthermore I had to pay for the services of Sir Lancelot, and that did not come cheap. I'm now in a very embarrassing, tumultuous situation now. I'm raising mixed-breed puppies that need to be vaccinated and homed, and this is all because of that damn dog of yours interfering with my Mutsy. I knew that this was going to happen. I had a dreadful feeling about the whole wretched business, especially after I saw that hole in your fence. I know your dog got through it. He must have got a hold of Mutsy some while ago. Couldn't stop pursuing her, could he?"
Paulette chose not to argue. She didn't want to live at loggerheads with her neighbour. So if it was money that Mrs. Garner wanted, it would be money that she would give her. And to Mrs. Garner's surprise, she promptly handed over her a cheque to the value of 7 golden retrievers. "I'm very sorry about Otis impregnating your dogs, Mrs. Garner. I hope this helps." "I hope you've come to your senses and had that damn dog of yours neutered. I can't have this happen again. It could literally ruin my business." "It won't happen again, Mrs. Garner. I can assure you of that. Otis has been neutered. What are you going to do with the puppies, if you don't mind my asking?" "Give them away, of course, as soon as they're old enough. I don't want anybody knowing about this, do you understand? This could ruin my reputation as a golden retriever breeder." "Of course I won't say a thing, Mrs. Garner. Your secret is safe with me. But if any of those puppies are going spare, I wouldn't mind a girl. Otis could do with a friend, you know." "You're welcome to one. I'm grateful you've seen sense to compensate me. But honestly, I'm grievously upset about this. I've had to let people down over this. I've had to make up some cock and bull story to appease them, and have put them on a waiting list for another puppy in the future. People are very upset about this. As I was saying, Mrs. Garner, I'm awfully sorry. I'm sure Otis is too." "Oh, please, don't give me that," said Mrs. Garner, raising a brow and giving Paulette a scathing look. "That dog is not remotely sorry about a damn thing. He thoroughly enjoyed every minute of getting his filthy paws over my precious little Mutsy. My Mutsy has never been with any dogs before that weren't thoroughbreds, until your dog came along. Anyway, I better get going. You are at least a reasonable woman, I will give you that." And with that, Mrs. Garner promptly returned to her old truck and drove off with her golden retrievers in the back. And Paulette hoped that she'd never see the annoying woman again. She knew that long-term disputes with neighbours could destroy your life if you rubbed them up the wrong way. And she adored their lives in the countryside, so she was determined to ensure that they remained on friendly terms with Mrs. Garner. "Did you hear that?" she said once the woman had gone. "You're a naughty boy, Otis. You made Mutsy have your babies, and Mrs. Garner's not remotely happy with you. You're in the doghouse." Otis looked up at his mistress through dark, very innocent eyes. He yawned and stretched out his paws, falling into a deep, contented sleep, obliviously unaware of all the trouble he'd caused. 1 year later, Dennis Harpsichord knew he shouldn't have drunk that third glass of wine at the bar in town. Certainly if his wife knew he'd enjoyed 3 drinks in a row, she'd have not been best pleased with him. She'd always warned him of his limitations when it came to alcohol, as his threshold was not particularly good. If you ever have more than 3 glasses of wine, she would insist, you need to leave your car behind in the car park and call a taxi. If I ever get wind of you driving drunk on your return from a bar, I'll never let you out of my sight again. I know what you're like. After 2 glasses of wine, you become incredibly blooded. You need to be a responsible drinker, love. The trouble was that Dennis Harpsichord rarely did think that although he'd drunk more than 2 glasses of wine from the Napa Valley, that he seemed to be holding his own this evening, as the wine appeared not to have gone straight to his head. He felt reasonably sober. He'd been wise enough to line his stomach with a burger and chips. What his wife didn't know would not hurt her, and he rarely thought that maybe his alcohol tolerance had significantly improved. He was at the bar to celebrate Brute Thomas's birthday. They did this rendezvous every year, when one of them had a celebration. The 2 friends were passionate wine drinkers. They'd thoroughly enjoy high-quality wine together from the Napa Valley. They enjoyed having a good old chinwag. Brute was in very good spirits this evening. His wife was expecting her 3rd baby, although he looked a little worn out and fatigued, and seemed to be rather glad to be enjoying a break.
Let me tell you, Dennis, I am so glad to be with you tonight, to be enjoying a drink with you. It is good to be away from the wife. She's in quite a grouchy mood this evening. This pregnancy has been a living hell for me. Unlike the other 2 that were pretty easy going by contrast. What do you mean, bro? My wife was practically angelic in her last 2 pregnancies. Of course, I didn't know it at the time. She did give me the runaround with her unquenchable desire for ice cream in both pregnancies. In fact, she ate so much ice cream, I thought she'd give birth to an ice cream baby, he joked. But this pregnancy, she's been grouchy, complaining about this, complaining about that. Usually what she complains about revolves around me. For some reason she keeps getting very upset with me for leaving the toilet seat up and forgetting to put my socks in the laundry basket. Little things that I do seem to be getting on her nerves. I can't bear to be in the same house with her at the moment. She's constantly having a dig at me. This time she's had cravings for pickles, which matches her very sour, bitter mood. Ice cream actually made her sweet. The pickles have turned her into a sourpuss, let me tell you. Well, I suppose every pregnancy is different, said Dennis reflectively. I imagine carrying a baby around for 9 months is likely to make the best of us cranky. You're probably right, bro. Thank God I'm not a woman, said Brute. But I'm telling you there are no more babies after this. I can't go through this again. If the wife wants another baby, I'll go off and get a vasectomy, without her knowledge, and I mean it. I can't do this again.
When Brute persuaded Dennis to have 1 more glass of wine, Dennis was rather reluctant. He put his hand over his glass, reminding himself of what his wife would have said if she knew he was about to embark on his 3rd glass of wine.
No more, Brute. I do have to drive home, he said. Oh, go on, Dennis. Don't be a spoil sport. This wine is the Napa Valley's finest, and it's my birthday. If you feel a little too inebriated to drive, I'll pay for your taxi myself.
The wine had been so delicious. It had been impossible to refuse Brute. And after the hearty meal, Dennis rarely thought that he was up for driving. He persuaded Brute that no taxi would be needed. But he began to regret the decision almost immediately, when he started up the car and drove away from the bar. He could feel the effects of the wine that he had drunk, but he told himself that the journey home, if he took the back roads, would be a very safe one. It was a pleasant summer's night, the temperature reasonably warm, and during the daylight hours the countryside was breathtakingly green. But at night, under the velvety canopy of the dark sky, everything was ambiguously obscure and rather vague. Dennis began to rub his eyes. His vision became rather blurry, and then as he manoeuvred himself down the road, a flash of white bounded before him, and then he felt a thump on his wheel. He stopped his car at once and heard a wincing sound, and then limping away, he saw one of Alice Garner's golden retrievers. He knew the woman lived around here. One of her dogs had obviously got out of the house, and he had inadvertently knocked into the dog. He wasn't sure what he'd done to it, but the dog would clearly need medical help, so he ran through the trees to catch up after the dog. But the golden retriever was nowhere to be seen, and Dennis was too wobbly on his legs to give the dog chase. Paulette. The clock on Paulette's nightstand was showing the time at 12:20 p.m. She woke up with a start, wishing to God that her husband had not gone to stay with his parents in Atlanta, because nobody likes to wake up in the middle of the night to hear that horrifying banging sound at the front door. It was certainly amazing that Poppy had not woken up from the dreadful sound that had sent shivers of dread coursing down Paulette's spine. Someone was at the door, and she didn't have a good feeling about nocturnal visitors giving her a call at the dead of night. As a child, Paulette had watched far too many horror movies, and memories of these movies did not rest with her very easily. I mean, who in God's name would be paying her a call at this unfortunate time of night? At least she had her two dogs, Otis and Otis's progeny, a dog called Alexa, who was a sweet black and white dog with a serene, docile nature that Mrs. Garner had only too gladly offloaded on her. At this point, the family's two dogs, who slept in baskets in the kitchen, were barking wildly and scratching at the kitchen door, really wishing with all their hearts that they could bomb their way to the front door, but that was not going to happen, because they were contained within the kitchen. Paulette reluctantly put on her dressing gown and slippers and ventured ever cautiously to the front door, wondering who could be there. She glanced briefly out of the window. There were no signs in the driveway of a car. She peered through the peephole and then saw the dark, shadowy silhouette of a Bigfoot, and she didn't even hesitate to open the door. Many would not be so confident with such an intimidating creature standing there, but Paulette knew the Bigfoot would not have got her attention if it didn't need her help in some way, and she was certain they meant her no harm. The tall, lofty Bigfoot was standing there in the doorway. This time it was the male, although she could see the female Bigfoot standing in the trees watching everything in the dark shadows, her eyes giving off a yellow eyeshine. The male Bigfoot looked incredibly troubled, his dark, soulful eyes filled with concern. He was carrying in his arms a golden retriever that was whimpering in pain. To Paulette's surprise, it was Mutsi, who always seemed to get herself into all kinds of trouble. Mutsi was, of course, one of Mrs. Garner's beloved golden retrievers. She was badly injured by the looks of things. There was blood all over her coat, and Paulette could not even bear to look at the poor dog, covered with so much blood. She hated the sight of blood, and Mutsi looked absolutely dreadful. She looked as if she'd taken a bad knock in the road. The Bigfoot looked into Paulette's eyes, and some kind of telepathic communication occurred. "Help her. She's my friend. She can't die. She's losing blood." "I'll do my best," said Paulette, raising her hand to gesture for the Bigfoot to stay exactly where he was, which he did. She grabbed her car keys and purse and indicated for the Bigfoot to put Mutsi in the back seat of her car. She then placed a blanket over the golden retriever. She was happy Mutsi was still whimpering, which meant she was still alive, and she knew Mrs. Garner would be devastated if she was to lose one of her most beloved retrievers. She needed to get to the 24-hour vet, otherwise Mutsi would likely go into shock and die. But she was lucky by the time she arrived at the hospital. They were able to stabilize the dog, give her some blood, and fix up a fractured leg. Paulette was told she had saved the dog's life, and the following day a very different Mrs. Garner paid her a visit, and when she opened her front door, the woman actually threw her arms around Paulette, bursting into tears. Gone was the condescending woman she had known from earlier encounters. "I don't know how to thank you.
You've saved Mutsy's life. Mutsy is very, very dear to me. Please come in, Mrs. Garner. Let me make you a cup of tea. You must not cry. Mutsy's going to make a full recovery and is going to be fine. Please don't call me Mrs. Garner. I'm Alice. And I'm Paulette, and by the way, I'm so glad I could help you, Mrs. Garner, that I was able to get Mutsy to the vet in time. I found her on my doorstep in a very bad way. Paulette knew better than to mention the two Bigfoots that had played a quintessential role in saving Mutsy's life, as some things are just best not shared. Honestly, that dog of mine is absolutely incorrigible. She is so mischievous, always gets up to all kinds of nonsense, and yet I love the bones of her. I've had golden retrievers all my life, Paulette, but Mutsy is the naughty one. I mean, look how she sneaked out to get together with your Otis. I wouldn't be surprised if she made the hole in the fence just to get to him. It's like she knows when she's on heat and wants to flaunt herself at all the male dogs. I don't think she's ever liked Sir Lancelot, you know. She's often sneaked out in the middle of the night if by accident I happen to leave the downstairs window open, which is a very foolish thing of me to do. But I've made that mistake more than once or twice, and every time she's got out. The other 9 golden retrievers stay in the house in their baskets, never dreaming of going out without my permission. But Mutsy has a mind of her own. She loves to chase the rabbits, and there's nothing I can do to stop her. Well, I think that might be why you're so attached to her, because she's so naughty. It's rather endearing, don't you think? Said Paulette. Well, maybe it is rather endearing, and maybe it is why I love her so much. But I will say she nearly died. If it wasn't for you, she might not be here right now. I received a phone call, you know, from Dennis Harpsichord. He's a very good man, you know. He was driving down the road past our property, after meeting up with an old friend of his at the bar for a drink or two. He couldn't stop in time when something ran across his path. It was Mutsy, of course. He'd heard a thump. He knew he'd hit something, even though he claimed he wasn't driving fast, but he did admit he was rather inebriated. He felt he should not have been driving. You know, I really appreciate the honesty of the man. He called me immediately to tell me what had happened, because he knew he'd hit a golden retriever. He didn't know who he had hit, but he knew he'd hit one, and I knew at once it had to be Mutsy. Anyway, he tried to run after the golden retriever, but he just disappeared. Well, Mutsy disappeared into the trees, and he had no way of finding her. So, what can I say? I am so very grateful to you, Paulette, for saving Mutsy's life. I would very much like us to be friends, Paulette. I'm very ashamed for the way I treated you in the past. I've been very unfair and judgmental towards you. You're not like other city folk, I can see that now. Paulette and her husband, along with their 3 children, are still in great shape these days, and Paulette now has 3 dogs running around her property, as Mrs. Garner insisted on giving her one of Mutsy's purebred golden retrievers as a way of saying thank you, which they called Daisy after her late daughter. She has not seen the Bigfoots again, but she knows they're out there watching over her family. So there you are. That's my story. Wow, what an incredible story. And what a fascinating encounter. Oh my word, what a beautiful story. Until next time, goodbye and good night.